Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this Productivity Insights Network webinar, where we're going to be looking at the question of how the effects of COVID-19 on macroeconomic demand and supply affect firm level productivity. So we're going to having a really effectively a from macro to micro look. And this is one of a range of webinars from the Productivity Insights Network that have been exploring a range of issues affecting productivity in the post-COVID-19 world. So my name's Andy Henley. I'm Professor of Entrepreneurship and Economics at Cardiff Business School, and I'm one of the co-investigators on the PIN project. And I'm chairing today's session. So before I go on to introduce our speakers, I'd just briefly like to tell you a bit about the Productivity Insights Network for perhaps those who might not be familiar. We're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. We're now about 2.5 years into our 3 or so years of funding. PIN is an interdisciplinary team of researchers. We come from across the social sciences and we're exploring a broad range of issues affecting productivity. So as a capacity building network, our aim is to engage with academics and intermediaries from other organisations across the UK. The project's led by Professor Philip McCann at the University of Sheffield and Professor Tim Vorley, who's now at Oxford Brookes University. So turning to today's speakers, we've got a double act of, first of all, Professor Don Webber, who's newly installed as Professor of Managerial Economics at the University of Sheffield's Management School. Don has a background in applied economics, but he says he's better described as a researcher of policy-relevant social science issues, and specifically is interested in research that puts people and social issues, rather than money, at the core of economic concern. And it's a joint presentation, and the second speaker will be Gary Dymski, who's Professor of Applied Economics at Leeds University Business School and is also one of the co-eyes on the Productivity Insights Network project. Gary has a broad range of cross-disciplinary research interests in the UK and internationally on topics including the UK productivity paradox, global financial governance, financial crisis and instability, and economic development, especially in low-income urban areas. Just a quick word about housekeeping. We very much welcome your questions. The speakers are aiming to speak for at most 40 minutes, which will leave us with plenty of time for questions at the end of our hour. So if you have questions and your questions are, you think of your questions as the presentation goes through, then please do post them in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we will be, it'll be my job as chair to kind of select those questions, which I'll be putting to our speakers once they finish their presentation. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Don, who's going to start sharing slides from his end, I think. So first of all, Professor Don Webber, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for chairing it. Thanks for PIN for giving us this this stage. Okay, can you all see the slides? Yeah. Okay. This is a paper which Gary and I have been working on. We're trying to understand how the effects of COVID-19 on the macroeconomic demand and supply affect firm level productivity. Now, sorry, just moving something. This is set in within the debate that macroeconomic policy debate at the moment in the UK, which is centered on 2 main areas. The first is the failure of the UK productivity to keep pace with other economies, particularly our main competitors, Germany, France, America, etc. Now, when we try to answer those type of questions, we tend to look to the aggregate supply side to guide us on policy formation. The other macroeconomic policy debate which we focus on in the UK at the moment is whether our austerity policies have helped or hindered economic growth. And when we look at that question, we tend to focus on the aggregate demand side. The COVID-19 pandemic has, or rather our policies have reacted to the pandemic has undoubtedly saved lives, I think. But the COVID-19 has also, or the reaction to it has also knocked this debate sideways. And the reason for it is because our production has reduced, our demand for products has been reduced because of our inability to move particular distances. At the same time, we've used a public policy, which I think was very good, of furloughing workers. This has resulted in 9.5 million workers across 1.2 million employers. But this has cost us nearly £30 billion. We've also experienced an expansion in the healthcare service, and at the same time, we've got declining revenues, VAT, etc. And because of this combination of issues which are going on contemporaneously, we've got government debt now exceeding national debt for the first time since 1963. So how do we sort out this problem? How do we restart the economy? Well, there seems to be three issues which are challenging us as economists at the moment. The first is, how do we reopen the supply side of the economy? How do we get firms to produce more? How do we get more more trading in the market? The second is, do we renew fiscal discipline? Do we need to keep the public sector expenditure under control? How do we do that, and should we do it now? In addition to this, we've got the issue regarding productivity. How do we enhance productivity? Should we be redoubling our efforts now to enhance productivity? And if we do, or if we should we then be using the science policy and the industrial strategy to guide us? So the dominant viewpoint at the moment for the pathway to restore economic growth is to focus on those exporting companies, to make sure that we, especially with Brexit coming along, we are competitive into the international market, and we are able to gain income from overseas to grow our economy, export-led growth. In addition to this dominant viewpoint, there is a belief that we need to have strong fiscal discipline. Will our austerity measures continue? Will they be strengthened again, or should something else happen? And the third part of this dominant view is that we should be trying to reduce firm failures and job losses, which obviously I believe that's the right thing to do, but the question is, how do we do it? Should we be focusing on our high productivity firms, following the industrial strategy, especially those with strong export potential? Now, that dominant view across those three issues is, it's very, very strong. But what we're going to do in our paper today is to try to challenge the viewpoint. And we're going to challenge it on a number of fronts. Okay, so the way we're going to challenge this viewpoint is to think about productivity and the measurement of productivity at the firm level. So the way we discuss productivity is often through some type of clean separation between demand and supply side policies on productivity analysis. There's this unintentional byproduct of the current metric being used to measure firm productivity. We tend to focus on the supply side. And when we look at macroeconomic data, it's very easy to ignore the interplay between demand and supply forces that affect individual firms. But when we drill down and look at individual firms, particularly when we move away from a one-dimensional understanding of productivity, then we're able to understand the interplay between demand and supply forces affecting individual firms in much more detail. Okay. I'm going to elaborate on those issues, obviously, as we move forward. So estimates of a firm's labour productivity tend to be computed by dividing the firm's gross value added by its number of full-time equivalent workers. In some cases, we divide it by the number of worker hours. That's another very useful addition to it. Where do we get this data from? We get most of this data from firm level accounting data, which is collected by the HMRC, and it's collected for tax collection purposes. So GVA figures, these are obtained by subtracting the market value of goods and services used up or transformed in the production process such as raw materials or intermediate inputs, from total revenues. Okay. So for instance, if a firm's total revenue is £100,000 and the total value of goods and services used up or transformed in the production process is £40,000, then our GVA is £60,000. If we've then got 5 full-time equivalent workers, we simply divide 60 by 5 and we've got a gross value added per worker of 12,000. Now this is one-dimensional. We can have very high revenue figures, and we can have, especially in perhaps the finance sector, for instance, and we can have a relatively small number of workers. So this GVA figure tends towards a very high positive number, but it also can be a negative number. That is when the market value of goods and services used up or transformed in the market in the firm's productive process is greater than the total revenue of the firm. So all of this is a one-dimensional understanding of these productivity figures. What we can do is we can move to a two-dimensional understanding of productivity figures. And if we do this, then we believe that it could permit a richer understanding of how shifts in the macroeconomic policy, demand, supply, etc., can affect firm-level productivity estimates. Okay, so how do we think 2D? Here's a diagram where we've got price on the vertical axis and we've got quantity on the horizontal axis. So the total revenue of the firm is the average sale price of the products multiplied by the number of products sold. So S star is the sale price, Q star is the quantity of products sold. So the area S star A Q star 0, or the origin, is the area of total revenue. Sometimes people use this as well as an indicator of productivity. It's effectively turnover. What we do to get our gross value added measure is we take away those costs. Okay, so we've got the, to get the costs estimate, we've got the value of the firm's costs is the goods or services used or transformed in the production process, is depicted by the area C star B Q star 0. Okay, so our costs include workers, for instance, who are directly used in producing a particular quantity of output. Individuals who are supervisors or participating in research and development, for instance, which cannot be directly mapped onto the units of output, will not be included in that C star. They will be have to be paid for by other parts of the revenue. So what we're showing here is that the way we measure gross value added at the firm level is this area here, which is S star, A, B, C star. Okay, so when we express our gross value added in a two-dimensional way, we've got this area, but how does the area change? I'd like to lead you through a few examples, because what we tend to think of productivity is, that greater productivity is probably led by technological advances, etc. But when we drill down to the firm level, we can reveal other interesting nuances. Okay. So for instance, imagine you're running a cinema and it's a lifestyle firm. It's 20% full most of the time. You've got 2 individuals. One person collects the money for half an hour leading up to the start of the film, and the other person runs the film. So what could happen is that an online film distributor decides to stop distributing the films, or it may be there could be a fashion to go out and watch a film rather than stay in. Without any change in policy of the firm, there could be an increase in demand for that product. What happens when that capacity moves from 20% to 80%? Well, Q star shifts to the right. There has been an increase in productivity at the firm level without the manager doing anything in particular. Anything particularly special on that front. So the Q star could shift to the right, and that would result in an increase in gross value added. What about S star? I do quite a lot of interview of individual firms and managers of them to try to understand their productivity, particularly in rural areas, but also in urban areas, etc. I was talking to a restaurant and trying to understand what drives their productivity, and they were emphasising, well, we charge what we do, we think we're in line with our competitors, etc. At the end of the interview, I had to inform them that the price of their coffee that they were selling was actually half of their competitors. And during the interview, they emphasised very clearly that actually they thought their prices were the same as their competitors. Very soon afterward, they increased their prices up to what they thought was, with this additional information, what they thought was the right price to charge. So what we're doing there is we're increasing the S star A line. It's shifting up. The gross value added area, therefore, is increasing. Okay, hasn't been technologically led. What about C star B? You could imagine, for instance, the supply chain from a farmer selling dairy products or milk to a supermarket. And you could argue that a supermarket could use its power in the market to reduce the payment to those farmers for milk. That would shift C star B line down and increase the GVA market, GVA area. So what you'll be doing here, the firm will be using their market power to increase their GVA. So we've got that area GVA which moves, which stretches, and there's a whole variety. You've got implicit contracts, etc., influencing this area. What we can then do is we divide that gross value added by the number of workers. Now remember, if the area was 60 and we had 5 workers per worker, we've got a gross value added per worker of 12. Okay. The next thing to recognize, if we think about productivity in this type of way, is that all firms are joined up. Okay, so think about this yogurt producer, which is the middle column. So the yogurt producer needs to purchase dairy from the farmer on the left of the diagram. What they do then is they employ perhaps a worker or 2 or however many in order to convert that milk into yogurt. They may, in addition, have people to redesign the packaging, to promote it, to advertise it. They'll be using some extra capital, and they'll be selling a pallet of yogurt to the yogurt shop for £290. We've got a gross value added of that yogurt producer at 150. So what else could influence this yogurt producer? Well, if the demand for yogurt in the yogurt shop reduces, then the yogurt shop is not going to purchase as many pallets of yogurt from the yogurt producer. Okay, so their total output into the market is reduced because of a demand shift. The Q star effectively is shifting to the left. That will then have additional knock-on effect to the dairy farmer, and their productivity would fall as well. GVA would fall as well. Another thing to recognize is that those individuals employed in this yogurt producing company have income. And what they then do is they spend that income in order to maintain their quality of life. So if there was a large reduction in the amount of yogurt purchased, then the wages for those workers would fall, and they would also have less money to spend. Okay, so when we move from a one-dimensional to a two-dimensional approach, what we believe we reveal is 3 important issues. Firstly, depicting the firm's total revenue as quantity sold times its sales price highlights the importance of the demand for the firm output. So its revenue derives from its sales. Secondly, costs can be distributed across units sold, but only some costs are linearly associated with output. Other costs exist independent of output, such as their relative weight of the share of cost depends on the quantity sold in a given period. And also, number 3, revenue depends on demand. Revenue flow depends on households, other firms, and all government demands for the firm's output. And its costs reflect, at least in part, its demand for other firms' products. So all of these firms, all of these workers and the government are all interlinked. Okay. When we move from this 2D, from a 1D to a 2D approach, we think we move away from this understanding, this visualization of mainly a supply side issue, to one where we focus much more on the interplay between demand and supply. Okay, so here's a couple of slides on the economy in response to COVID. So when we were in the Great Depression, GDP shrank by no more than 1% a month. When COVID-19 came along, the economy shrank in March by nearly 7%. In April, it shrank by over 20%. In May, there was a bounce back, a slight bounce back of 1.8%. But this still meant that we were below our level of GDP by nearly 25% of what it was in February 2020. With the greater level of uncertainty in the market, with concern about with job security, etc., that may well be one of the reasons why we're saving more. This is another statistic from the ONS talking about savings habits and the rebounding of that. But if we're saving, then we're not spending. Okay, and if we're not spending, then that demand in the economy slows and other companies are not selling their products. They're not selling their products, so they don't need to employ as many workers. So the ONS also reports the number of paid workers, employed workers, was down nearly 2/3 of a million people compared to March 2020, and that was before all the recent announcements of job losses, which are higher in some sectors than in others. Job vacancies have also fallen. They're at the lowest level since the survey began in 2001. Again, that's nuanced across sectors. So job vacancies in distribution I would suggest are relatively high, but in other sectors they're lower. This isn't only a demand-sided aspect. The actual number of hours worked also fell by 5.5 hours per week to a low of 26.6 hours in March to May. If we're not working as many hours, obviously we're producing fewer products. Pay as well fell. So pay fell according to most measures in April, declining more in industries where furloughing was most prominent. Pay is now falling in most measures where many furloughed workers are not having their wages topped up by their employers. And if that's the case, then they've got less money to spend. And if they've got less money to spend, they're not buying as many products. And Q is going to shift to the left, and therefore productivity, as we measure it at the firm level, will fall. There is good news announced on Tuesday by the government that 900,000 public sector workers will get an above inflation pay rise. Doctors and teachers, etc., of up to 33.1%. That should maintain some level of demand for those particular workers. But we do know that the economy is in the doldrums. The ONS states that itself. The volume of retail sales did increase by 12% in May, but as Suren Thuru of the British Chamber of Commerce emphasises, this might simply reflect pent-up demand as restrictions began to loosen, rather than particular evidence of a genuine recovery. We also know that nearly half of the businesses in some sectors are temporarily closed. 48%, for instance, of people in 48% of businesses in the arts, entertainment, and recreation remained closed between 15th and 28th of June. Okay, so we've got this way of thinking about productivity at the firm level in response to changes in macroeconomic demand and supply. What we really want to emphasize here is a number of things. So the level of demand for the product is shown by the area S star, Q star. So a fall in consumer demand due to the direct or indirect effects of the lockdown shifts Q star inwards and to the left. And all else equal, this alone will reduce the firm's measured productivity. Even if firms have opened business, Q star may shift to the left because of the lockdown, because the lockdowns prevented customers from buying their goods. The UK retail sales dropped by a record 5.1% in March, a record for a single month fall, and that occurred even though the lockdown did not start until the 23rd of March. The diversity of the change in the consumption habits was also stark. There was a 31% increase in the volume of alcohol purchased, at the same time as a 34% reduction in clothes sales. So this is having different effects on different parts of the economy. We're mindful, therefore, to focus on this Q star and how this Q star is moving in different firms in different parts of the economy in response to the change in demand and supply because of COVID. But there was also endogenous shifts with every shift in Q star. So a firm's triangle, rectangle, which includes direct costs such as factory rent, irrespective of the level of output, they will have those costs will have to be paid irrespective of the firm's revenue. So this second shift also adversely affects the measure of firm level productivity. Now, if supply chains break down, then there will be a shortage of intermediate inputs, and this will pull Q star to the left as well. And if required labor is not available, then this shortage shifts Q star to the left, such as migrant laborers who have been made to return home, for instance. In these two cases, the demand for the firm's product will exceed supply, but the margin of its revenue over costs will decline unless it puts upward pressure, unless it puts up its sales price, S star. If the cost of either intermediate inputs or directly required labor increases, then the height of the line, C star B, will also rise, therefore squeezing net revenues. And firm survival may thus depend on the ability to shed costs. Some workers will be laid off, especially those on short-term contracts. Experienced, skilled, high-wage, long contract workers are more likely to be retained as they're more difficult to replace. Workers are more likely to be able to work from home as well. A firm's cash flow from the current operations can also turn negative. And this is true by definition for those firms whose output levels have shifted from Q star to zero. As costs rise and revenue shifts in, so firm survival will be questioned. And when cash flows turn negative, firms must use their reserves to meet their costs. Firms lacking reserves must either rely on external support, such as from lenders or from government schemes, or they will go bankrupt. The government can urge lenders to forgive or defer debt payments as a stopgap measure, but if low levels of effective demand persist, then business closure and worker redundancies will be inevitable. So what we can highlight here is that there is a key difference between thinking about productivity in the one-dimensional one, which we're used to thinking about it, or the two-dimensional way. Let's use this slide to push that point home a little bit further. Suppose that all firms in a region can be divided into three groups: high-tech, as led by the industrial strategy, firms, key firms, key services such as in healthcare, food supply, and all other firms. Let's also assume that high-tech firms have higher revenues per worker, and a region's GVA is the simple sum of these three groups. So from a one-dimensional perspective, what should we be doing? Well, we should be protecting the cash flows of high-tech firms so they survive the lockdown. We should also be ensuring the key services are sustained during the lockdown. But the third group, the all other firms, whether they're supported is a matter of policy indifference. Their supply is included in the GVA calculations, but it's not viewed as driving productivity higher. Okay. So what the one-dimensional approach therefore misses is the fact that the demand for each firm's output emerges from the cash flows generated by the interplay of demand and supply. Post-lockdown disappearance of any of these firms will reduce the number of workers, their wages, and hence the demand in the market, and thus will pull regional gross value added downward. I'm going to hand over now to Gary.
All right. And let me unmute myself. Hold on a second. Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you,
Okay,
Gary.
good, excellent. I'm
Did you?
sorry for the confusion. Let me get this thing full screen and then we'll go. All right, and let's do like this. And is it now visible?
Yeah, but we're not in full. You're not in full screen. That's it. Great.
Okay, excellent. Now, basically, the story then is that, you know, we need a kind of system of systems approach here to understand the full dimensionality of productivity. And what I want to do is really highlight a few factors going forward. One is that the firm itself, this firm that might be ignored, as Don has pointed out, in the round, this firm can control certain aspects of its medium run performance, as highlighted in the top part of this slide here. It's got to comply with regulations, reopen safely, it's got to manage its costs, remotivate and re-recruit its workers, and control its own production efficiency. However, it's important to recognize that this firm does not control its medium run prospects fully. First of all, there will be cash flow effects from the interactions between firms, and there will be, you know, possibly the territories of consumption and the geography of supply will be changing. So there are these dimensions here, and then there's the question of whether the consumers will be able to really, you know, deal with the changes in tow. Now, basically, there's 2 points then to be made about this. One is something that's come up in discussion even yesterday at the National Institute, and very much in our own PIN discussions, the question of regional inequality and inequality as well within the regions, including the kind of region that Don was talking about. And that is to say that what we see both inside a region, inside a city, and across, is that there's a kind of clustering that you see, you know, low-income households that are have more precarious work and so on are going to likely be together. Upper income households with a higher percentage of knowledge workers that have more secure jobs will be clustered. And the key workers, so famously discussed in recent days, often have precarious employment status and jobs that are in the lower and middle end of the spectrum. The thing is that, you know, these areas each have their own, it goes into a discussion about the geography of flows of money across borders. But essentially, you know, areas are buying and selling from one another. And if what we see in that top part of this screen of this slide is that there's going to be a tendency for the income to be more secure, the spending more secure, and the shops across the board to be more supported in areas that have more secure and upper income workers. Areas that are less supported in regions as well will tend to see falls, and private sector investment will tend to follow these patterns. And the second thing about it to be said is that in addition to the spatiality of this, we're going to see endogenous preference shifts, which, as has been much noted and discussed, in no return to normal, are going to be widely variable and currently uncertain. The graphic here shows you a little bit the kind of diverse areas of change in terms of even, let's say, supermarket food and necessities purchases. You see the, you know, different entities performing in different ways as things have gone forward. And another factor that comes into play here in terms of how any given firm's key space, its value added, will be affected, has to do with policy shifts, which have to do indeed with which sectors can open and which cannot. And we see this going sequentially as we go forward. So, you know, what we do see is that there's a real challenge here in terms of firm-to-firm linkages. What people want is changing, and public policy is in flux. So we already had the challenges of climate change and regional inequality and household inequality before us. But what we see is the need for owners and managers to really think about their resilience, how to sustain their cash flows, and so on, and within the context of what their demand and supply is and where they're located. We know in particular that strategic flexibility is going to be especially crucial for the small and medium enterprises that occupy many of the key niches throughout our economy, and that account for, first of all, the dominant number of firms in the business population for most of the employment and for half the turnover, according to ONS. So this flexibility and this adaptability will be crucial as we go forward. And I guess the point we want to make about this is that, how can this be managed, and how can we especially preserve and pay attention to the role of the SMEs as we go forward here? Well, this slide and the next basically just point out a couple of things. One is that we need scenarios. We need to develop ideas about how to have more localized economies and sustainable economic pathways. And as we've seen, because of the complexities that come into full focus with the 2D model, those are convoluted pathways, and there's a lot of interweaving of economic forces on the demand as well as the supply side. And essentially, there's this phase 1 and through to phase 2 here. We go from the shock, changes, and demands. Just shows you kind of how things have gone. We're in phase 1.1. Then we see the pandemic changing the way that we habitually consume. And as we get into phase 2, and then actually as we move to the next slide in a moment, basically the suggestion here in this scenario, speculative as it is that we're maybe seeing changes in preferences and what people are doing, and how workers are consuming, and how they're participating in their local community and economy. And as we go deeper into that pathway of change, we will see concomitantly the reshoring of production to some extent, more resilient supply chains, more localism, less long distance travel. Strengthening of local economies is something that can be done. And this can indeed go in the direction of helping local firms. This could be encouraged by government policies that shift us in a sustainable direction, less wasteful consumption, more socially beneficent socioeconomic engagements, move us towards sustainable development and more organic and local food consumption and production. We could then see sort of, efforts to renew the high street with innovation and with an emphasis on the vibrancy of our local lives. This morning's BBC broadcast talked about the death of culture in the UK. Hard to imagine that. And this is something that can be really augmented by paying attention to all of these local linkages. The point here is that, and this really is that second last paragraph here that's crucial. This kind of scenario means to create a more sustainable and resilient economy is going to require planning, and it's going to require policy space at each level, at the regional as well as the national levels. And since we're already in the middle of change, then we're going to see, the need to continue forward and take advantage of this moment. So basically, consensus before the pandemic was that basically you've got these independent pathways to pursuing demand side and supply side policies. And that basically what you needed to do to take care of productivity was to focus on your high productivity firms. Our model here shows that actually demand supply linkages are crucial at all levels, the firm level up through the macro level. And that whereas supply side measures of efficiency invisibilize demand, demand is always there. It's always there. And so basically the picture that's revealed is not a simple or homogeneous one, but we see this complex interplay of demand and supply specific factors, linkages through consumer markets, supply chains, and the financial sector. So that essentially we see this interweaving at all levels, firm, regional, national. We see the need to basically pay attention to the fact that reimposing fiscal discipline will have consequences that are going to show up in measures of productivity, that if we engage them, And furthermore, that as Don's examples show, productivity itself offers an unstable policy target. And so to conclude at the conclusion here, so to secure our future and to take advantage of this moment, it means incorporating not just competitiveness, but other indicators. How about stronger levers of social cohesion, reduce inequality, well-being, social and ecological sustainability into the decision-making framework that's guiding post-COVID planning, both for productivity and for the economy and society as a whole. Thanks for your attention, and now we'll turn it back over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much to Don and to Gary for that really interesting presentation. We've got I've got a couple of questions so far, both really interesting questions actually. So I'll kind of let you decide who wants to tackle these. First one from somebody who's anonymous. Are there any particular challenges in assessing public sector productivity impacts of COVID? The interesting question here is whether actually we're seeing unmeasured increases in public sector productivity, because the public sector workers are busy having to kind of run the show at the moment. And is that offsetting or masking some of the depressing productivity effects that we might be seeing in some regions? So if you have a kind of a lagging region with a large public sector, is that kind of masking what's really happening in private sector productivity?
Don, I think that's for you.
Okay, thanks, Gary. It's a difficult question to answer, but may I take us on a slight tangent? We've been doing some research trying to understand the responsiveness of community businesses to the pandemic. And because of the lockdown, because of a reduction in the distances individuals have been able to move, they're not, they've been less able to help their family, they haven't been seeing their friends as much, mental health is falling. Who's been picking up the baton here? Many community businesses have got their ears to the floor, to the ground. They have had to fill in some of the gaps because of all the austerity measures that have been going on over the last 10 years. So I think the productivity issue focused at the public sector is missing some of the really important factors which are affecting people's lives, I think at times like this we need to focus on things which matter more than productivity, where some of these productivity measures are stretched in different ways for reasons which we didn't necessarily foresee.
Yeah, and I would just add that much of, if not all of the public sector activity is regarded as transfers or services that are unpriced. And so much of it is missed in productivity measures. So the question's well taken, but it goes to the point that to really get a systemic view of what's happening region by region, we need to take this total picture into account, not just to focus on partial measures.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got another great question here from Lena Chevallieva. What about the selection of firms in response to the COVID demand shock? I mean, I think this is sort of speaking to this big question about, you know, what Andy Haldane, Chief Economist of the Bank of England, talks about, the long tail, talks about zombie firms. What's likely to be happening to that kind of long tail of low productivity firms, and how, if there's a selection effect taking place, how will that affect regional inequality and aggregate productivity? And then kind of related to that, you know, what are the government policy impacts at the moment on that selection mechanism? I can see that. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, let me start off with that. Yeah, I know that the first thing to be said is that many of the empirical studies of productivity really look just at supply side factors. And I know that Haldane has argued that much of and the Bank of England studies to some extent, much of the differential in terms of productivity and the problem resides within sectors, not between sectors. And that's the fat tail or the inefficient firms. That undoubtedly that's true to some extent. However, let's keep in mind that when you're missing the demand side in your measures of productivity, what you're doing is you're allowing a lot of variance in econometric terms to be out there looking for something to attach itself to, and you can start to find things like management differences and fat tail. I think it's important to take into account first that the problem of training and the adequacy of the educational and retraining capacity of the nation is crucial. A lot of that to be done won't be counted in productivity, but will prepare the way for a more adequately, a more efficient supply mechanisms as we put those back in place. And as we confront the possibility of moving out of the Eurozone and out of the European Union into a WTO framework, many of those firms are going to be at risk of losing revenues, and they're going to look even worse in that viewpoint. We have to really see things whole and not be confused by the fact that management problem, fat tail firms are part of the story, but only a part. That's kind of the punchline of our paper.
So perhaps before I bring Don back in, there's actually another closely related question from Mike Stonyanov. Do you think that the government's job retention scheme actually hampers productivity because it's preventing the optimal allocation of resources? So effectively, it's the kind of question from the other way around, saying, at the moment, we're not really seeing the impact on productivity because the government is protecting the long tail of weaker firms. People get paid less to stay at home instead of trying to find new jobs or start new businesses, innovating to survive.
True, right. I mean, it is true that people are sitting at home. However, what we have to consider is that shock effect is there no matter what. The fact that protection has to do with, could workers who are, have not yet been laid off but will be, could they optimally find new employment outlets for themselves or start businesses meaningfully at this point in time under these conditions? That's less certain. And again, what we've tried to emphasize in the last part of today's presentation is that we need some pathways and some sort of government to make investment in social and other kinds of infrastructure so as to guide people along pathways to find their way to new paths. Even when some of them know that those are coming, there's not yet the means to connect people up with those.
Don, do you want to come in on either of those 2 points? Or?
Yeah, I agree with everything Gary said, but I would like to add the fact that this is a very uncertain time. Demand profiles are changing. We've shifted quite a lot of our consumption online. Individuals, it appears to me that fewer individuals are shopping in supermarkets. Instead, they're buying their weekly shop online. There are individuals who try to avoid going to supermarkets because of the number of people in supermarkets, and therefore buying locally in butchers and etc. So all of these shifts in buying behaviour might have beneficial effect on a small number of poorly performing firms, but on the other hand, it could also be the case that firms which in the past have performed relatively well may start performing relatively badly.
So thinking about the demand side, I've got another really good question here from Shweta Sharma. I mean, thinking about this in the sort of kind of Keynesian world, often people will talk about automatic stabilizer effects. And actually, we're kind of seeing a lot of that at the moment with effectively a very generous high replacement ratio, to get technical, regime in which people are getting virtually 80% up to 100% of their prior earnings to be staying at home, or if they're self-employed and they're actually are covered. Not all self-employed are covered by the income support scheme. They're getting a very generous cash provision. Would unemployment insurance and other direct payments to fired workers mitigate the demand shock from emerging from COVID-19? So that's the question. I mean, is this not as bad as it might be because of the kind of automatic stabilizer effect, in other words?
Don?
Well, it depends how individuals respond. Yes, they would have some income which they can exercise and demand in the economy. But on the other hand, if they see that they're going to be unemployed for a very long period of time, you know that they're going to be cutting back their demand.
If I can jump in then on a couple of things. One is that, as was pointed out in Don's slide that showed the increase in savings, we see that people are consuming less. That's the consequence of some of these shifts going on. And it can be argued, I've seen the Institute of Fiscal Studies and so on has noted that the government's going into deficit to replace some of the income. The unemployment schemes of various kinds is, creating a situation in which, in a way, we can use those extra savings, borrowing from today's savings to pay for this gap, and so on by pushing funds in various ways. However, there is a kind of pushing on a string aspect to this, as we were discussing the other day, that essentially you push money to different people, you push income, but what are they doing with it? What are people willing to do? Are those automatic stabilizers as effective given the profound uncertainty under which we're operating? This is where some firm directions and even sort of initiatives that go to how will we rebuild our transport infrastructures, our housing, how will we take care of augmenting the social care, the basis of our adult social care and the health systems. These kinds of things can be done very concretely that will, in a sense, force demand in places where otherwise it's not right now. That can lead to some of that labor reallocation as well.
Okay, got another really interesting question here from Peter Howley. Have you thought about how best to communicate this important message to key decision makers? I mean, perhaps if I turn that around slightly and say, how receptive are you finding, perhaps particularly within the regional context, the kind of local policymakers, people operating at city regional level or devolved government level? How are they kind of engaged with that debate, or are they largely passive actors?
I've been working quite a lot with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority and some of the local authorities there, and with my partners Andy Brown and others. And what we find is that, first of all, there are many plans that are being developed at that level. They have to do precisely with taking on challenges of sustainability, training, transport, and so on. So the plans are there. The spending capacity is not. And so there's this kind of pause while we wait to see what Treasury will do. We wait to see what the cabinet offices and the government will do. And so there's a kind of, if this was a relay race, we would see that we're at that moment where the baton is about to be passed, but it's uncertain as to how that can happen. We've seen the conversations, for example, very systematically coming out of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, have pointed to the fact that this has been an optimal time to overcome the secular stagnation by making investments in our nation. This is an effort that can be done through devolution and through the devolved authorities, as well as at the national level. So I think that the will is there, some of the planning is emerging, but the capacity is not yet clear.
Don, do you want to say anything?
Yes, it's a very good question. Keynes, I remember in the front of his book, saying that what he was pushing wasn't terribly difficult. The difficult thing was unlearning what we think we already know. When I talk to county councils they seem to be very open to this. But as we progress towards more central government, I think there's a particular way of thinking about these targets, and that they are almost immovable. So enhancing productivity is really the way forward. Thinking more from this two-dimensional perspective is more difficult to switch to, at least in my experience.
Okay, got one final question, I think. Well, we might be able to squeeze one more in if there is another one. Certainly, this is the last question on the list at the moment, from Felicity Algate. Do you have I mean, this is right down to the kind of micro nitty-gritty here now. Do you have any views on what a good local high street might look like in a post-COVID world? Is it going to be one in which there are fewer shops and more cafes?
Possibly. And in some sense, if we think about that idea of self-employment, SMEs, unique local niches that can be filled in part by renewing the spirit of social cohesion and sharing at that level. So you could imagine, for example, shopping spaces in which there would be a number of cafes and boutiques, even individually or collectively owned, rather than necessarily large firms occupying those spaces. Housing as well will probably be reintroduced to the city center. This will go along with the, in some cases, aging of some of our societies, and the need to think about ways to have transportation-friendly, dense infrastructures of living space where people can really enjoy that proximity and sociality. I think this will be a beneficial consequence of thinking both about economic and ecological sustainability going forward.
Don, do you want a final say on that?
Yeah. Thanks. It's a very good question, and I think there are a number of factors we need to consider. The first thing is the territories of products. So if we increasingly purchase items online, then and we're used to them being delivered to our door, then the items we would be buying complementary to them might vary and evolve. So if we become more, if we expect more deliveries, then what should we be buying locally? I think we're going to move towards experiential type purchases locally, coffee shops and these sort of things. But I think there are also other issues. So for instance, there will be some town centres, city centres, which are going to be more dynamic than others. And I think that would result in some individuals wanting to move to some of those areas, which will push house prices up. It will push other individuals into, because the rental prices will go up in line perhaps with the house prices. Individuals with lower spending might then move down to the next tier of cities, which has lower local expenditure. And I suspect there will be an increasing hierarchy of many of these places, where at the top of the hierarchy there will be lots of things to enjoy, to experience, to spend money on locally, and there will be quite an interwoven local economy. But at other aspects, there will be towns which are dying, where house prices go down, rental values go down. Spending locally goes down, fewer and fewer experiences, and I think there's going to be increasingly that continuum.
And that's the scenario to be fought against as we move forward.
And on that bombshell, as they say, because in a sense that's sort of a slightly pessimistic conclusion, because it's more of a process that we're already very concerned about, at least those of us who worry about regional inequalities. But thank you very much indeed. I think we've now run out of time, so I'd like to thank thank all of our audience for joining this webinar today, and particularly to thank those of you who had some really interesting questions to ask. Thank you also to our speakers, Don Webber and Gary Dimsky. There will be a recording of this webinar available on our webpage, which is productivityinsightsnetwork.co.uk, and you'll also be sent a short feedback form in the next couple of days, and we'd be really grateful if you could spare a few minutes to complete that. It only remains for me now to give a plug for our next Productivity Insights webinar, which is on the 30th of July at 12 noon, Sectoral and Spatial Impacts of the Pandemic and Subsequent Recovery. And that's going to be presented by Ben Gardner and Richard Looney, who are both from Cambridge Econometrics, and they're joined by Professor Rob Huggins, who's a colleague of mine from Cardiff University. So further details on how to join that, to register for that webinar, are on our website, productivityinsightsnetwork.co.uk, and you'll also find regular updates and reminders of what's going on our Twitter feed at productivitynw. So thank you very much indeed. That's this webinar over. Thank you very much to our speakers and to all of you for joining us.
Thank you,
Bye.
Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew.